You ever get called something so unexpected, so bold, it stops you in your tracks? I did. And not by a stranger or a rude customer in a store.
No.
It came from my daughter-in-law, standing in the kitchen of a home I helped pay for, with her voice sharp and proud like she had just scored a personal victory. "You're just a freeloader," she said. Just like that. That one word didn't just sting. It split something open inside me. Not anger at first. Not even sadness. It was something quieter, something colder.
A click.
Like a switch had flipped. That moment was the beginning of everything that followed. And trust me, you're going to want to stick with me to the end, because how I responded wasn't loud, wasn't emotional, but it was something else. A move that changed all the power in the room. If you've ever been underestimated, disrespected, or made to feel like you don't belong in a space you helped build, this story is going to hit home. So let me ask you something. Have you ever done something out of love, only to have it thrown back in your face? Maybe you watched your children grow, supported them through school, helped them set up their adult life, and then one day, suddenly, you're not needed anymore. Worse, you're seen as a burden, an inconvenience. Like the stories moved on without you, and now you're just the unwanted footnote. That's how it started for me. I didn't move in with them, because I had nowhere else to go. I moved in because they asked me to. After my husband passed, the silence in my house became unbearable. My son and his wife said, "Mom, come live with us. You shouldn't be alone." And for a while I believed them. I wanted to believe that love meant something, that family meant something. But love, as I learned, can be layered with conditions. Respect, on the other hand, that's either there or it isn't. And before we go further, I want you to know, I'm not here to play victim. I'm here to tell you how I took control back. Not through shouting or revenge in the dramatic, movie-style sense.
No.
What I did was patient, calculated, and yes, a little bit poetic. You came to this video probably curious about how someone goes from being called a freeloader to owning the very roof over the heads of those who tried to shame them. And I promise you, you're going to get your answer. But I'm going to take you deeper than that. I want you to understand the emotions that lead up to the decision. Because the truth is, this isn't just about property or rent or titles. This is about the quiet ways people try to erase you. The moments when you start realizing that your presence, once welcomed, is now met with tight smiles, whispered conversations, and slammed cupboard doors. And that moment when you finally stop hoping they'll treat you better and start planning your next move instead. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, why didn't you just move out? And I'll tell you why. Because walking away doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes, the only way to be truly free is to stand your ground and change the game from the inside. I spent a lifetime building my stability, and I wasn't about to let it be undone by someone who had no idea what I'd been through. Someone who thought they could twist the narrative in her favor just because she held the loudest voice in the house. She didn't know who she was dealing with. And she never once imagined I had cards of my own. That's the beauty of being underestimated. People don't see you coming. But let's rewind for a second. Before the mortgage, before the confrontation, before the silence turned into a battlefield. Let me introduce you to the key players in this story. There's me, of course, a 63-year-old woman, retired from nursing, widowed, and not looking for a handout from anyone. Then there's my son, Daniel, a kind soul, but easily swayed. He's the type who avoids conflict, who says yes to keep the peace even if it means betraying his own comfort. And then there's Hannah, my daughter-in-law. Sharp, driven, always perfectly dressed, always performing. From the outside, you'd think she had it all together. But behind those closed doors, she was a master at subtle cruelty. She never yelled, never slammed doors. But her words, those sharp little comments coated in sugar, left bruises that didn't show. And the worst part? She always made it look like I was the one being unreasonable. Classic manipulation, dressed up in manners. At first, I told myself I was imagining things.
That she was just stressed.
That her clipped tone and tight smiles weren't personal. That the exclusion from dinners, the sudden cold shoulders, the way she would refer to their home, as if I were just visiting, it was all just in my head. I made excuses for her because I wanted to keep the peace, because I didn't want to make Daniel choose. But one night, one specific, unforgettable night, everything changed. And it wasn't even a big fight. It was just a quiet comment tossed out like trash. You know, it's hard enough managing bills without a freeloader in the house. She said it while pouring wine. Didn't even look up from the glass. Like it was the most natural thing to say. Let that sink in. After everything I had done. After everything I had given. That was how she saw me. And here's where I made the choice. Not to cry. Not to defend myself. Not even to leave. I smiled. I excused myself. And I began planning. Because I realized in that moment that she had no idea what I was capable of. She thought I was weak. She thought I was desperate. She thought I had no other options. But I had something she would never understand, patience, resources, and a memory like a steel trap. And from that moment on, I knew, if they thought I was a freeloader, I'd show them what it meant to own. You're probably wondering, how did I go from being insulted in their kitchen to holding their mortgage in my hands? How does someone like me even pull that off without them knowing? Oh, I'm going to tell you. And it's not just about money. It's about knowing where the cracks are. Watching. Listening. Waiting. It's about making moves without ever raising your voice. It's about learning that power doesn't always wear a crown. Sometimes it sits quietly in the corner, counting coins and keeping receipts. But I'll leave you with this before we dive deeper. I didn't do it to be cruel. I did it to survive. To remind them and maybe myself that I was never weak. I was never a burden. I was the one they called when the world went dark. I was the one who kept the house running when Hannah was on maternity leave, when Daniel got sick, when the bills piled up. They forgot who I was. But I didn't. And what I did next, let's just say it changed everything. Back when Daniel was little, he'd follow me around the kitchen with his toy dinosaurs, dragging them across the tiles while I stirred soup or folded laundry. There was a time when he couldn't sleep without saying goodnight to me at least 3 times. So, it's hard to reconcile that image with the man who now barely made eye contact when his wife took over the conversation. Something in him had shifted, but I couldn't quite place when it started. Maybe it was when they bought the house. Or maybe it was when Hannah's parents started visiting more often, always with a passive-aggressive compliment in hand, making subtle jabs at my presence in the background. You see, on the surface, everything looked like a typical modern family. 2 working parents, a child on the way, a grandparent helping out at home. But underneath, things were off balance, uneven in a way that made you question your own footing. That's the danger of long silences. They start to distort what's real. You begin to wonder if you imagine the slight, if maybe you are overstaying, if maybe they're just tired and you're being too sensitive. That's how they wear you down bit by bit, quietly. And when you finally react, they can hold up their hands and say, "What?
I didn't mean it like that."
But you know they did. You felt it. The way Hannah would thank me through gritted teeth when I picked up their groceries. The way she started calling me Daniel's mother in front of her friends instead of mom or even my name. The casual exclusion from weekend outings. The way I'd come home and find takeout containers in the trash, even though no one had invited me. These weren't accidents. They were rehearsed, controlled. She was curating a narrative, and I was starting to realize I wasn't meant to be a character in their new life. I was the shadow they were trying to erase. Still, I didn't say anything. I kept doing what I always did, waking up early, making coffee for everyone, folding laundry no one noticed, cleaning up messes that weren't mine. Because that's what you do when you love someone. You make space. You bend. You soften your presence. But every time I gave more, she took more.
And Daniel?
He just kept shrinking into the background, becoming more and more like a guest in his own marriage. That's what disturbed me most. Not her cruelty, but his silence.
His refusal to see.
Or maybe his decision not to. Then came the baby shower. A sunny afternoon in their backyard, plastic tables set up with pastel streamers, a mommy-to-be, sash draped over Hannah's shoulder. I wasn't asked to organize anything. I found out about it through a Facebook event. I stood near the fence for most of the afternoon, holding a tray of deviled eggs like a server instead of a grandmother. At one point, I overheard one of Hannah's friends ask her if Daniel's mom was staying long-term. Hannah laughed and said, "Hopefully not. We're trying to ease her into independence." She said it like I was some sort of dependent child, like I hadn't worked 40 years in healthcare, raised a family, paid off a house, buried a husband. That moment crystallized something in me. It wasn't just a matter of disrespect, it was erasure. I wasn't inconvenient. I was in the way. And Hannah, for all her civility, was making sure I knew it. That night, I didn't sleep. I started thinking about my savings, about the modest investments I'd made over the years, about a conversation I'd had with a friend months ago where she mentioned something strange, how property records were public, how you could look up mortgage information online with just a few clicks. I didn't know why I remembered that in that moment. Maybe some part of me had already started plotting without realizing it. But I sat at the dining room table, lights off, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating my face like a ghost story was about to unfold. And in a way, I started digging. Property tax records, public filings, lender names, loan amounts, and what I found made my heart thud quietly in my chest. Their mortgage had just been refinanced. Hannah's name wasn't even on the deed, just Daniel's. That struck me as odd. Very odd. For someone who talked a big game about being in control of the household, she had no actual ownership. I went further. The lender was a small private firm. Nothing huge, nothing flashy. A place where money talks and background checks are formalities. I didn't make any decisions that night, but I saved the documents. I made copies. I started making calls. You'd be surprised how willing people are to share details when they assume you're just a curious old woman asking about interest rates and investment opportunities. I started talking to a contact who used to work with my husband in real estate. I told him I was interested in buying a mortgage note.
Just an idea.
Nothing serious. He asked me why, and I simply said, "Let's call it family business." That's when things started happening fast, and here's where the mystery gets deeper. Because around that time, Hannah's behavior shifted. Subtly, but noticeably. She started asking me odd questions. If I'd been in the office that week. If I was still in contact with any of Daniel's old friends. If I'd be willing to help them with a little financial cushion for the nursery. All this right after the baby shower incident. It was like she suddenly remembered I existed, but for reasons that felt too precise. Too rehearsed. I couldn't shake the feeling that she knew something was off. Or maybe she had her own secrets unraveling. There was also the man who showed up one afternoon when no one else was home. Claimed he was there to inspect the basement, even though we'd never scheduled anything. Said something about a valuation check, but his badge looked fake and he left quickly when I started asking questions. It bothered me. A lot. Because it didn't fit into the rest of the picture. Who sends an inspector without notice? And why had Hannah come home that day looking rattled, her usual sharp tongue replaced by a strained smile? I started wondering if maybe I wasn't the only one playing a game here. Was Daniel in trouble financially? Had Hannah taken out loans he didn't know about? Was the refinance mortgage part of a larger problem? And most importantly, was I walking into something far more tangled than just family drama? I didn't have all the answers.
Not yet.
But I had momentum. And more importantly, I had leverage. I knew enough to make my next move quietly, carefully. And when the time came to strike, it wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be emotional. It would be irreversible. But then something happened that I didn't see coming. A voicemail, left accidentally, by Daniel. And what I heard on it changed everything. When I first heard that voicemail, I thought I must have misheard it. I replayed it 3 times, staring at the phone like it had betrayed me. It wasn't a full conversation, just a snippet. Daniel had been talking to someone in the background, unaware that the call had gone to voicemail instead of disconnecting. His voice was muffled, almost nervous, and then there was Hannah's, sharper, quicker, unmistakably agitated. "She's starting to act like she knows something," Hannah snapped. "You said she'd be easy to manage." Then silence, followed by the faint sound of a door shutting. That was all I had. But it was more than enough to confirm what I'd been feeling for weeks. There was something happening behind my back, something bigger than just disdain or domestic cold shoulders. I didn't know exactly what yet, but that voicemail, it was a crack in the mask. The problem was, I couldn't confront them without giving away that I knew. Not yet. So, I did what I've always done best. I listened, I waited, and I started gathering every scrap of information they didn't want me to have. I began checking their mail. Nothing invasive, just the stuff that sat around for days on the counter. Credit card offers, late notices, the occasional suspicious envelope from a consulting firm I'd never heard them mention. I made copies of anything that looked remotely off. But just as I started piecing together a timeline, something strange happened. The folder I kept hidden in the back of the kitchen cabinet, gone. Not moved, not misplaced. Completely gone. I asked Daniel if he'd seen a manila folder while cleaning, and he just blinked like I was asking him in another language. Hannah, on the other hand, was suddenly full of sweet concern. "You should really be careful with your personal documents, Mom," she said, placing a cup of tea in front of me like I was the one who needed managing. That night, I barely slept. If they had found the folder, they knew I was watching. And if they hadn't, then someone else had been in that house. Things began shifting in subtle, chilling ways. The Wi-Fi password changed. The hallway light, which I always left on at night, started flickering mysteriously, even after I replaced the bulb. One day, I found my bedroom window open, even though I hadn't touched it in days. Then came the stranger. A woman in her 40s, well-dressed, professional-looking, who stopped me outside the grocery store. She addressed me by my full name and said she was concerned about how much time I was spending digging through financial records that didn't concern me. She didn't say who she worked for, just handed me a generic business card that listed no company, only her name and a private number. When I asked what exactly she meant, she smiled tightly and said, "Some families collapse under the weight of old secrets. You don't want that, do you?" Then she walked away like nothing had happened. At that point, I started questioning everything. Was this really about a mortgage, or had I stumbled into something far more tangled? A deeper layer of family tension that had been hiding behind birthday cards and polite smiles? Because the thing is, Daniel wasn't always like this. He used to be open, almost too trusting. But over the years, he'd gotten quieter, more cautious. I always assumed it was just marriage, work stress, new responsibilities. But now I wasn't so sure. One night, while he was in the garage and Hannah was upstairs, I snuck into the guest room closet where they stored old boxes. Tucked behind a stack of photo albums, I found something that made my stomach flip, a sealed envelope addressed to Daniel from over 10 years ago. The return address? A name I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter, short and to the point, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. It said, "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth back then.
She thought it was for the best.
But you deserve to know." There was no signature. No details. Just that. And that's when something old came back to me, an argument I had with my husband over a decade ago, just after Daniel got married. He'd wanted to tell him something he claimed was his right to know. But I shut it down. I didn't want to disrupt Daniel's new life. I told myself it wasn't necessary, that secrets were better left buried. But now I realized I didn't even know what that secret was. And worse, I had no idea who else did. I started retracing everything. The mortgage, the stranger at the store, the missing folder, the voicemail, and now this letter. A letter that pointed to a hidden past I never thought I'd need to unpack. Suddenly, my plan to quietly reclaim my dignity had turned into something darker. Something messier. Maybe it wasn't just about teaching them a lesson anymore. Maybe this was about figuring out who they really were and what exactly they were hiding from me and from each other. And then, just when I thought I'd hit the limit of strange occurrences, I received a bank notification for a withdrawal I never made. From an account only I was supposed to access. An account in my maiden name, which no one in that house should have even known existed. That's when I realized someone was watching me far more closely than I had ever imagined. The moment I saw the notification, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just a withdrawal, It was a deliberate, specific amount taken from an account that had been sitting untouched for years. An account I opened in my 20s, long before I married, under my maiden name, and used only once to transfer a small inheritance from my aunt. I never mentioned it to anyone, not even my husband. There were no linked cards, no shared documents, and no trail that could connect it to my current life. It existed in the shadows, quiet, private, secure. Or so I thought. For someone to not only access it but to withdraw, a round figure, as if making a point, told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't random. It was a message. But from who? And what were they trying to say? Before I could dig deeper, my phone rang. It was my sister, Linda, calling from Arizona, where she'd moved after retirement. We don't talk every day, but she knew enough to sense when something was off. She asked if everything was okay, and for a moment I almost brushed it off. Then she said something that stopped me cold. I got a weird envelope today. No return address. Inside was a photo of you. From your wedding day. But here's the thing, it was cut. Your face was circled in red ink, and there was a note written on the back. It said, "Some debts never go away." Her voice shook as she spoke. I thought maybe it was some kind of prank, but it didn't feel like a joke. I stood frozen in my kitchen, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. A photo from decades ago, sent to my sister. Targeting me?
Why?
And why now? Suddenly, everything started to twist inside out. This was no longer just a bitter family drama or a strategic retaliation over a cruel insult. This was something far deeper, something crawling out of a forgotten past. And now, it wasn't just me being watched, it was people close to me, people outside this house. That changed everything. I called the bank immediately, demanding an audit. They confirmed the transaction was made in person, at a small branch miles away from where I lived. A man had walked in with a photo ID under my maiden name and withdrawn the funds using a forged signature that was eerily close to mine. I asked if there was surveillance footage. The woman on the other end hesitated before saying, "There is. But you'll need a subpoena to access it." The legal route would take weeks, if not months. But that wasn't the part that chilled me. It was the subtle pause in her voice. Like she'd seen something on that footage she didn't quite know how to explain. Over the next few days, strange patterns began emerging. Items in the house moved slightly from where I left them. Passwords on my laptop reset without explanation. Even my journal, something I kept hidden in the linen closet, had pages that felt touched, rifled through, like someone had flipped them with oily fingers and left faint smudges behind. And then Daniel began acting strangely too, more withdrawn than usual, often leaving the house for errands that didn't make sense. One night, I followed him. I didn't tell myself I was spying, I just needed to understand what I was missing. He drove across town and parked outside an unfamiliar building. A low-rise office complex that looked like it hadn't been remodeled since the 90s. I watched him sit in the car for 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel like he was preparing for a confession. Then he got out and entered the building. 20 minutes later, he came back out looking pale, shaken, almost like he'd seen a ghost. I waited until he drove off and walked over to check the building's directory. There were only 3 tenants listed. One was a local insurance agent. One was a grief counseling service. And the last one, an attorney's office with a name I didn't recognize but felt instinctively wary of. When I got home, I searched the firm's name. Turns out, they specialized in estate recovery and legal mediation, particularly in cases involving disputed family inheritances. My stomach twisted. What could Daniel possibly be doing there? Unless he was preparing for something I hadn't even considered. Had he found out about the old account? Was he planning to file something behind my back? But just as that theory began taking root, another crack opened beneath it. Linda called again. This time, she was scared. Her house had been broken into. Nothing stolen. Nothing out of place. Except for one thing, a dusty photo album left wide open on her dining table. The exact same wedding photo of me, now missing. Replaced with a copy of our childhood picture, one of her and me, laughing by the lake during a summer trip. Across the image, someone had written, "Truth floats." It made no sense. But it didn't have to, not yet. What mattered was this. Someone was deliberately playing with us. Not just threatening, but taunting. Bringing back memories, triggering guilt, twisting the past into something sharp and dangerous. I started thinking back, trying to remember every unresolved thread from my life. And one thing surfaced. Something I hadn't thought about in years. Before I met my husband, I was briefly engaged to someone else. A man named Craig Maddox. Charming. Passionate. Intense. Too intense. We broke things off after he became possessive.
He didn't take it well.
And then one day, he disappeared. Moved away, no forwarding address, no phone calls.
Gone.
My husband never knew the details, and I never brought it up again. But what if he didn't disappear? What if he had just gone underground, waiting? I searched his name online, heart pounding, fingers trembling. And the first result was an obituary, published 5 months ago. But the photo that accompanied it? It wasn't the Craig I remembered. It was someone else entirely. Someone who looked unsettlingly familiar. Because the man in that obituary looked exactly like the inspector who came to the house that afternoon, asking about the basement. That night, something changed inside me. I had been walking on the edge of something dark, but still able to pretend, at least in small ways, that this was all some tangled misunderstanding, that the threats were symbolic, the warnings vague enough to ignore. But when I saw the face in that obituary and matched it to the man who had stood in my house pretending to be an inspector, all that denial peeled away like old paint. I realized in that moment that I wasn't just being toyed with, I was being hunted. And the worst part? I didn't know why. My heartbeat was loud in my ears as I sat alone in the living room, the TV on mute, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Every creak in the house made me flinch. Every car passing outside felt like it could stop and deliver something terrible. For the first time since this all began, I genuinely felt unsafe under my own roof. It didn't help that Daniel was acting more distant than ever. When he came home that evening, I watched him from the hallway as he stood in the kitchen, staring into the refrigerator with the door open, unmoving. There was something hollow about him. His shoulders slumped, like he was carrying a weight I couldn't see. I wanted to ask him what was going on, to press him about the attorney, the meeting, the strange behavior, but fear held me back. What if he wasn't on it? What if I pushed too hard and gave myself away? Worse yet, what if I was wrong about him entirely and lost the only person I had left in the process? I felt trapped in a slow-burning nightmare, the lines between right and wrong, safe and unsafe, loyalty and betrayal growing blurrier by the hour. Then Linda stopped answering my calls. It started with 1 missed call, then 2. Then a full day went by, and I left voicemail after voicemail. I texted, emailed, even called a neighbor of hers. No one had seen her. No emergency alerts, no hospital notifications, just silence. That kind of silence that feels intentional, manufactured. I filed a welfare check request with our local police department, and after hours of waiting, they finally called back and said no one was home. Her car was in the garage, but there were no signs of forced entry, no note, no clues. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The officer's tone was calm, almost dismissive. Maybe she just needed some time away, he said, like she was on a spa retreat. But I knew my sister. After everything she had just been through, the threatening letter, the break-in, there was no way she would just disappear without telling me. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the house became amplified. I kept thinking about that fake obituary, the forged withdrawal, the photo with the red ink, and now Linda missing without a trace. It was all connected somehow. A string of events tied to something old and buried, something I hadn't fully remembered, or refused to face. I started feeling like the walls themselves were watching me, holding in secrets I was too late to stop. I thought about that old engagement with Craig Maddox and started wondering what I really knew about the man. He'd been charming but possessive. Disappeared, too cleanly. I tried to dig further into the obituary, searched the name of the funeral home, tried to find anyone who could verify the identity of the deceased, but I hit wall after wall. It was like that name didn't exist before the date on the obituary. Like the photo had been planted there on purpose, for someone to find. Then came the message. Not a letter, not a voicemail. This time, it was personal. I came home from the grocery store to find the back door ajar. My heart immediately sank. I knew I had locked it. I always double-checked, even more so lately. I walked in slowly, calling out, hoping maybe Daniel had come home early or Hannah had forgotten something. But no one responded. The house was too still, too quiet. I moved cautiously, checking each room until I reached the kitchen. And there, taped to the fridge, was a single sheet of paper, plain, white, with typewritten words in the center. Dig any deeper and you'll bury more than secrets. No signature. No name.
Just that.
I sat down at the table, hands shaking. I kept staring at that note, feeling the weight of each word pressed down on my chest. This was no longer just about revenge or family tensions or old wounds resurfacing. This was personal. This was intimate. Whoever was behind this knew where I lived, what I cared about, and now they were in my home, daring me to keep going. And despite everything, despite my fear, my exhaustion, the tight knot of dread pulling tighter by the day, I wasn't ready to stop. If anything, I felt a deeper pull now. Because whatever this was, whatever truth they were trying to bury, it clearly mattered enough for someone to scare me away from it. That made it dangerous. That made it valuable. But the more I tried to make sense of it, the less the pieces aligned. Daniel, the mortgage, the missing money, the phantom inspector, the fake obituary, Linda's disappearance, the eerie note, they were threads, yes, but they didn't tie into any single shape yet. I was chasing shadows, walking through fog, grasping at truths that kept slipping just beyond reach. What if the threat wasn't about Craig? What if it wasn't even about me? And then I remembered something so small, so seemingly insignificant that I almost dismissed it. Months ago, Hannah had gotten a phone call late at night. She stepped outside to take it, pacing in the backyard for nearly 30 minutes. When she came back in, she was pale and flustered, snapping at Daniel and pouring herself a large glass of wine. I asked her if everything was okay, and she brushed me off, saying it was work stress. I never thought much of it again until now. Until I realized that was the exact same week they had refinanced the mortgage.
It wasn't about me.
Not originally. It was about them. And I had stepped into something I was never supposed to see. I hadn't planned on opening the attic. Not that night. Not ever really. That space had always felt like a dusty graveyard of forgotten things. Baby clothes, holiday lights, cardboard boxes full of old tax papers. But something compelled me. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the rising storm of paranoia in my chest. Either way, I pulled down the creaking ladder and climbed up, flashlight in one hand, heart pounding like a war drum. The attic smelled like insulation and time, dry, sharp, and stale. I stepped carefully, the beam of light cutting through the dark like a scalpel, searching for something I wasn't even sure existed. And then, tucked behind an old trunk covered in spider webs, I found a small metal box I didn't recognize. Locked, but not securely. The latch had long rusted, and with a little force, it popped open. Inside were papers, dozens of them, folded and stacked with clinical precision. Medical records, signed forms, photos, and letters, some addressed to Daniel, some to a name I didn't recognize. But what hit me like a blow to the ribs was a birth certificate. Daniel's birth certificate. Only, it didn't list me and my late husband as the biological parents. It listed another woman. A woman named Margaret Ellis. And the father? No name. Just blank space. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, trying to process what I was seeing. I turned over letter after letter, many of them written in shaky handwriting, from Margaret to someone named Thomas, begging him to reconsider an agreement, to let her see her son again, to stop pretending the adoption was his choice. The dates didn't lie. Daniel had been born to someone else, adopted before his first birthday. And somehow, I, had kept that hidden all these years. I remembered fragments of conversations I dismissed as the vague background noise of memory. My husband once mentioning that we were lucky to have had Daniel come into our lives when we did. I always assumed he meant after a miscarriage. I never asked. I never wanted to revisit the grief. But this changed everything. Daniel wasn't our biological son. And somehow he didn't know. Or maybe he did, and everything happening now, his secret visits to attorneys, his quiet withdrawal, was part of some internal war I had no idea he was fighting. Had he found out? Had Hannah? Were they trying to track down the truth, protect it, or bury it? The next morning, I confronted Daniel. I didn't show him everything, I just asked him a simple question. Do you remember your birth mother? His face went pale. All the color drained from him, and his hands trembled slightly as he set his coffee mug down. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice cracked. You weren't supposed to know. Hannah found out last year. She did a DNA test after the baby was born, and it didn't match your side of the family. That's how she figured it out. I stared at him, stunned, my breath caught between heartbreak and confusion. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, barely above a whisper. Because I didn't want to believe it, he said, shaking his head. I thought it was a mistake, or that Dad had handled everything legally and never told you. But Hannah, she didn't stop digging. She hired someone. That's when things started spiraling. It all came rushing in like a tidal wave. The inspector. The stranger at the grocery store. The mysterious messages. They weren't just about money or resentment. They were warnings. Someone out there didn't want this secret to come out. Someone with a lot more to lose than we realized. Daniel admitted that the man in the obituary, the one I'd thought was Craig Maddox, wasn't some ghost from my past. He was a private investigator Hannah had hired and then cut ties with after things got too personal. Daniel suspected he had uncovered something damning, something about his birth parents or the adoption itself, but he died under suspicious circumstances not long after they cut him off. No investigation. No autopsy request. Just silence. And Linda? Her disappearance was no coincidence. She had always known something was off. My husband once confided in her after a heated argument, years ago, about making a mistake too big to fix. We thought she was just being protective when she warned me about Hannah, but maybe she was scared. Maybe she'd started piecing things together. And maybe someone made sure she didn't get the chance to finish. Suddenly, the entire narrative turned upside down. This wasn't just about a daughter-in-law calling me a freeloader. That insult had been a spark, but the fire had always been smoldering beneath the surface. This was about legacy, identity, secrets buried so deep they had rewritten our family history. Someone out there had been pulling strings for a long time, and now the strings were unraveling. Daniel looked me in the eye, tears building, and said, "Mom, someone threatened the baby." That was the part he hadn't told me. Someone had left a photo of their newborn on the porch, clipped from a hospital newsletter, with the words, "Asterisk, the past always comes back." Asterisk. And just like that, the stakes were no longer about uncovering the truth. They were about protecting the next generation from a lie that had finally grown teeth. And I realized, for the first time, I wasn't the one being hunted anymore. We all were. It was just past midnight when I made the decision. I wasn't going to sleep through another night knowing pieces of my life, our asterisk life, had been stolen, manipulated, and rewritten by people hiding in the margins. The air in the house had changed. It had weight, like it knew something was coming. I didn't bother telling Daniel. He had his own demons to deal with, and after our last conversation, he was in no shape to face what I knew had to happen. I gathered the documents from the attic, the original birth certificate, the letters, the photos, and slid them into a folder. I added a copy of the bank statement from the unauthorized withdrawal, the envelope Linda had forwarded before she vanished, and the note left on the fridge. Everything connected, even if I didn't yet understand how. I didn't have a plan beyond that. I just knew where I had to go. There was only one person left who might still hold answers, and I had a sick feeling she'd been playing all sides from the very beginning. I drove across town to a small house near the edge of a quiet, wooded suburb. It belonged to Margaret Ellis, Daniel's birth mother. I had tracked her down after finding her name in the adoption records buried deep in the files from the attic. She was still alive, still in the same town, living a life just out of reach, like a shadow nobody noticed. I had never met her, never spoken to her, but I needed the truth, and I needed it now. Her porch light was on when I pulled up, though the house was still. I stood there for a long moment before knocking. When the door opened, the face that greeted me wasn't surprised. She looked older than I expected, more tired than I imagined, but her eyes held none of the confusion or hesitation I braced for. She simply stepped aside and said, "Come in. I figured you'd show up eventually." The living room was quiet, warm, unnervingly neat. I placed the folder on the table between us. She didn't reach for it.
She didn't need to.
"You knew he'd find out," I said. She nodded once, like that truth had long settled in her bones. "I tried to keep the past buried," she said softly. "But I should have known Hannah would dig until she hit bone." My pulse quickened at the sound of her name. "You know her?" I asked, already fearing the answer. She smiled, not kindly. "Of course I do. She's my niece." The air left my lungs like I'd been punched. I blinked, trying to make sense of the words, but they stood in the air, solid and inescapable. "She grew up watching me grieve the loss of the child I never got to raise," Margaret continued, her voice steady but cold. "She saw what that did to me. So when she married Daniel, she made it her mission to restore what she thought was stolen. She wanted me back in his life, on my terms. But I didn't want that. Not anymore. It was too late." She looked down, eyes clouded with something between guilt and bitterness. But Hannah didn't accept that. She started planning, manipulating. She thought she could force a reunion. Everything began falling into place. Hannah's passive-aggressive behavior, her obsession with financial control, her sudden shift in behavior the moment she found out the baby's DNA didn't match mine. She hadn't been trying to push me out because she hated me. She'd been trying to dismantle my place in Daniel's life so she could replace it with Margaret. What I mistook for cruelty was part of a calculated effort to erase me from the family history altogether. The fake inspector, the strange threats, the withdrawal from the old account, those weren't scare tactics, they were misdirection.
Tools to destabilize me. To discredit me.
To force me out of Daniel's world and open the door for someone else to walk back in. But what happened to Linda? I asked, my voice low. What did she know that made her disappear? Margaret's gaze shifted. For the first time, she looked uneasy. She reached out to me. A week before she vanished. She said she was worried about Hannah. That she had hired someone who'd gone rogue. That things were getting out of hand. Her hands trembled slightly. I begged her to go to the police. But she said she couldn't. That she had no proof. She was going to come here to talk, but she never made it. I stood, my skin crawling, adrenaline flooding every corner of my body. So, that's it? Hannah orchestrated all of this behind the scenes, tried to control the mortgage, sabotage my finances, frighten my family, just to bring you back into Daniel's life, without his consent. Margaret's expression hardened. She wanted to give me a second chance. She thought she was fixing the past. But she doesn't understand the damage she's done. She thinks the ends justify the means. She paused, eyes locked on mine. You're the one who raised him. Not me. You're his mother. But she doesn't see it that way. I didn't wait another second. I drove straight back to the house, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't know what I would say, what I would do, but I knew Hannah had to be confronted. The minute I walked in, I knew something was wrong. The lights were off. The silence was heavy. And then I heard it, a soft whimper from upstairs. I ran, heart pounding, throwing open the nursery door. Daniel was sitting on the floor, cradling the baby, his eyes wide with shock. Hannah was gone. A note lay beside him on the floor, scrawled in her handwriting. It said, *, don't look for me. I'm doing what should have been done a long time ago. *. We called the police. Filed the report. Turned over everything, the documents, the threats, the recordings. Days passed. Then weeks. No sign of Hannah. No digital footprint. No financial trail. It was like she'd vanished into thin air, just like Linda. But something told me this wasn't over. Not yet. Because a week later, I received one final envelope. No stamp. No address. Just left on the doorstep in the early morning hours. Inside was a photo, me, Daniel, and the baby standing in the backyard months ago. A perfect moment. And behind us, barely visible in the trees, was a woman. Watching. Smiling. Time moved differently after Hannah disappeared. Days blurred together, filled with investigators, social workers, phone calls, and endless explanations to friends and neighbors who politely asked how we were holding up, without really wanting to hear the truth. There were no new leads. The police filed her as a missing person, but the momentum faded as quickly as it came. The world moved on, but the house didn't. Every corner held her imprint. The half-read parenting books by the bedside, the faint scent of her perfume on the nursery curtains, the indentation of her name carved invisibly into our routines. But where her presence used to feel suffocating, now it was haunting. For weeks I would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I had heard her voice downstairs, or that I saw a shadow passing by the back porch light. I never told Daniel about those moments. He was grieving in his own quiet way, cradling the baby at night like a shield, as if holding on tightly enough could protect her from the weight of the past. I let him. He needed that illusion. We both did. Eventually, the truth came into focus, not through a dramatic confession or final confrontation, but through the slow, painful process of letting go. Margaret came by once, just once. She didn't ask for anything. She just stood in the doorway, eyes glassy, looking at the child that was her blood, but not her legacy.
She thanked me.
Not for raising Daniel, but for choosing not to destroy him with the truth too soon. For giving him a chance to grow up loved, even if it was under a lie. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded and watched her walk away, her shoulders a little straighter than when she arrived. She never came back, and in some ways I was grateful. The past had already leaked enough poison into the present. There was no need to invite it to dinner. Eventually, I sold the house. The memories were too heavy, and the walls had absorbed too much pain to feel like home. Daniel didn't argue. He helped pack the boxes, each one a quiet conversation we didn't have to say aloud. We moved into a smaller place, closer to the city, where we didn't need guest rooms or attics full of secrets. I bought out what was left of the mortgage, again, but this time, not out of revenge. It was about control, closure, and rebuilding something stable for the baby, for Daniel, and honestly for myself. I'd spent so much time watching from the margins, trying not to intrude, to be the helpful mother-in-law who didn't overstep, who didn't claim space. But now I realized that sometimes love meant standing firmly in the middle of the storm, not on the sidelines. And I wasn't going to apologize for that anymore. But the twist, the part one still can't explain, came 3 months after we settled into the new place. A package arrived with no return label. Inside was a small USB drive, tucked neatly in a box of tea bags. I plugged it into my laptop with trembling hands. There was only one file. A video, barely a minute long. Grainy footage of a park, a child's swing swaying gently in the wind. The camera zoomed in, slowly, shakily. In the distance, on a bench, a woman sat with her back to the lens. Blonde hair pulled into a low bun. A stroller beside her. And then, just before the video ended, she turned her head slightly, as if sensing the camera. It was Hannah. No mistaking it. She looked calm. Not scared. Not fleeing.
Just at peace.
And then the screen went black. I never showed Daniel. I couldn't. I didn't know what it would do to him to see her like that. To know she might be out there, watching us, choosing to stay away for reasons we'd never understand.
Maybe she thought it was safer that way.
Maybe she truly believed she was protecting us from some deeper danger we still hadn't uncovered. Or maybe she just couldn't face the damage she'd done. I'll never know, and I've stopped asking. Some stories don't end with clear answers. They don't gift you perfect closure or tie everything into neat little bows. They linger. They stretch across generations and echo through bedtime stories and holiday toasts and the long silences we fill with hope. In the end, I didn't get revenge. Not really. I got something better. I reclaimed my voice. I took back my place in the narrative. And most importantly, I protected my son, not just from the lies of the past, but from losing himself in them. Now, Every morning, I sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint soft light across the neighborhood. The baby coos inside, Daniel hums as he preps a bottle, and for a few quiet moments, everything feels right. Not perfect, but real. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, I get the feeling that someone's watching, not with malice, but with memory. Like a chapter that's been closed, but not forgotten. And that's okay. Because the truth? Some legacies are better rewritten. And some ghosts just want to make sure they're not erased.